Well, good morning. Good being with you. Some of you may not know that a few years ago, as time passes so quickly, I hung out at this congregation as the pastor for about 10 months. And it was a wonderful time for me. I'm sure some of you are still recovering. But I had a great time, and it's great being with you again today. Thanks for the invitation. A story that maybe some of you have heard before has to do with the truck driver. This truck driver had been up and driving since early morning, and by midday he was tired and lonely and hungry, so he thought he'd get some of his needs met. He saw a sign along the highway that said cafe 1 mile next exit, so he went that next mile, went to the exit, came up to the cafe, parked his rig, went inside and sat down at the counter. As he did, the waitress came, and the truck driver looked at the waitress and said, "You know, what I really need is a piece of pie and a kind word." Upon hearing that, the waitress went back into the kitchen, cut a big piece of pie, put it out on the plate, came back and set it on the counter in front of the truck driver. The truck driver looked at the pie and then looked at the waitress and said, "Well, there's the pie. Now, how about that kind word?" After a while, the waitress just looked at the truck driver and said, "Don't eat the pie." I don't know about you, but sometimes when I really hope for the best, it does not always happen. But I think it seems to me that one of the practical realities of trying to have the best life that we can have is that we need to hope for the best. One of the best definitions of hope that I've come across was given by Søren Kierkegaard. A couple of centuries ago he lived. As a Danish theologian, he said this about hope. For him, hope was having the passion for what is possible. Hope is having the passion for what is possible. That is, the daily intensity to be able to see that what might happen in your life or in that day, you stay after. Okay? So some of you may know people that are profoundly hopeful, and I would imagine that one of the ways you were described in is, boy, they had a passion for what they thought was possible. Another thing that we ought to be able to understand about having a good life is that we need to plan for it. You know, oftentimes Martin Luther King would be talking about, "I have a dream," but behind all of that, King would say, "I also have a plan." And so in order for a dream to come true, we have to have a plan, do we not? And to try to use that plan as best we can. But in spite of hoping for the best and planning for the best, one of the realities of life is this: unexpected frustrations still happen, right? Okay? You all know that firsthand, without question. Unexpected frustrations still take place. And that's essentially what this parable is about this morning. That we have this farmer who is expressing his frustration at this unexpected frustration that there are weeds in his field. And how does he express that? He says, "An enemy has done this." Now, when I look at this parable, I think one of the assumptions that we can make is that this farmer really is a pretty good farmer. He seems to do his best. He knows how to plow, knows how to plant, he uses the right seed. It just seems that he has done everything to continue to prosper and succeed, being a good farmer and having a good result for his crop. As one person on this parable wrote, said that if fairness is in the world at all, and if fairness has anything to do with this world, then this farmer is the one who ought to be able to succeed at having a good crop. But here we read in the parable, after he finishes plowing and planting, sowing the seed, he goes to bed. And late at night, an enemy comes and sows the seed of a weed amidst all of this wheat that he has sown. And he wakes up and finds it and realizes that after several months have gone by, that this weed has actually grown and intertwined itself in the weed. Now, my understanding about kind of Middle East agriculture is there's something that's called a darnel. Have you heard of that in the story? Okay. A darnel is essentially a weed that looks so much like wheat that when it intertwines itself and months go by, A farmer can go out and see the weed, but there's nothing that he can do, because if he tries to take the weed out, then the wheat will come out as well. So you remember where he is asked by the hired hands, what do you think? Should we just go ahead and cut this down? He says, no, don't do that. Let it continue to grow. When it is time to harvest, we will cut the wheat down, take the weed out. Okay? That's how we will handle it. Now, one of the things I think we really need to remind ourselves of is that in chapter 13, it is a chapter that is full of parables. Matthew's got probably almost as many parables as Luke does, but in the 13th chapter of Matthew, the parable that comes before this one is the parable of the sower. Remember, sowing in different fields and kind of getting different results. And the parable that comes after this one that was read to us today is the parable of the mustard seed. Okay, another parable about kind of the dynamic quality of the kingdom of God when it's planted in your midst. Seems pretty small to begin with, but it will grow, and one must trust that. So, this particular parable is telling us that we have an element about what it means to grow. And the basic premise of the parable is this. You can do the best you can, like the farmer did, but in the end, the outcome is up to God. Okay? You can sow a good field, but there may come times and opportunities where, in fact, something happens that you cannot do anything about it necessarily. So that, I think, is a wonderful message in the sense of God will take care of the growth. But I also know it's kind of challenging for most of us to say, what? I do my best and then I have to wait to God to kind of decide what's going to all come of this. I don't know about you, but I don't like to necessarily think of myself as kind of a control freak, but when I look about how I try to create my daily life, I'm pretty much in control, okay? I want to be able to see that I've succeeded, I've got a successful life, this is the way I want things to go, and so oftentimes I want to call the shots, okay? And so when we hear, do the best that you can, but realize in the end it will all be up to God, that's really very hard for many of us to hear. So one of the questions for the farmer is, why did this happen? Farmer, I think, probably said, man, I did everything I could to create this wonderful crop, and now look at what has happened. And I think sometimes we can say the same thing. I've tried to do the best with the life that I have been given to me, but stuff has come my way, and I'm wondering, why am I having to deal with this? Why did this happen? Sometimes I think it's a very good question, and maybe there are occasions where we can look at our own life situation, and when something hasn't gone well or like we really wanted it to, we can see maybe the cause or the reason or the outcome from which it has occurred. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, now that I look at this, I can see where I should have done this, or maybe I could have done that, or maybe I should have said this or not said that, okay? Sometimes we have answers to the question, why did this happen? Why are there weeds in my life? The question is, what can we do about it? A lot of folks have said, well, sometimes you can do a lot, okay? And as Christians, we ought to do a lot. Just remember Paul's words to us. That's a lot to do, okay? We have a role and responsibility to do the very best we can with what has been given to us. That's our accountability as a Christian. But here's the point. The parable is telling us, in the end, we are called to do the best that we can, but in the end, it will all be up to God in terms of what the results will be. Okay? I kind of like that. I want to turn it over to God, but there are other occasions where I want to keep this into my hands, okay? I want to be in control about how the outcome is going to occur. So one of the things I think we need to realize in this parable is that when we do our best, we have to let it go. That's all we can do. We can't do any more than that. And the grace then of saying, maybe then God will take over something in my life that will allow me to deal with this dilemma or difficulty or suffering or setback that I've not yet been able to see. And that's a measure of trust, is it not? To be able to say, what I'm dealing with, I can't do any more with. I have done my best. I'm going to trust in the belief that God somehow will be able to allow me to see the best in my life, or the best of God in my life, if I can let it go and trust that God's grace, God's will, God's way is going to happen. That's a challenge, is it not? I think for most of us, we would prefer to write the outcome, and when we wrote the outcome and it didn't happen that way, it was a mistake, it was a failure. But one of the challenges with the farmer was to be able to say, listen, you've done everything that you can. Now you've got to realize that what happens next is in the hands of God, and you can trust that. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read a question or a parable like this, I ask the question, well, why are there weeds in the first place? Okay? Where did these weeds come from? Okay? I've done so much and so often and so regularly to try to live a good life, and now I've got weeds in my path, weeds in my backyard and front yard. What on earth is going on? Anytime you're reading scripture and you come across the word or the symbol weeds, okay, it's trying to tell you that we live in an imperfect world with imperfect people. Okay? That's a lesson we've got to learn. Farmer had to learn it, we have to learn it. When Jesus talks about there are weeds in the world, he's basically saying this is an imperfect world and there are imperfect people. Okay? Imperfect people, imperfect world. So, one of the realities in this parable again is that when Jesus said an enemy has done this, the implication is that God hasn't. A lot of times when weeds come into our life, we think maybe God's trying to tell me something or do something to me. And the assumption of this parable is that, in fact, God had no role in putting weeds in the farmer's field. God intends for us to have a full life, a weedless life, a good life, wanting the very best for us. But when there are weeds in the world, it is just helping us understand the reality of the world and the human condition that we live in. There are weeds. There are imperfect situations. There are imperfect people. And you know what? Every Sunday morning when we gather together, we remind ourselves of that, do we not? Imperfection is just a part of who we are. Some years ago, Mark Trotter, retired senior pastor, wrote a wonderful sermon about this, and he made reference to Derek Bach. Derek Bach, a number of years ago, was president of Harvard. And Dr. Bach was asked the question, what is the outcome for students who get an education at Harvard? What do you think it is? And Dr. Bach said this, my hope is that any student that gets an education at Harvard has an increased tolerance for ambiguity. Okay? An increased tolerance for ambiguity. And I think what Dr. Bach meant by that is that we live in a world that is full of complex problems with complex people, and there are different people who have different opinions, but our hope is that in the midst of all of that, they will bring their intelligence and their integrity into the conversation, and we will find a way to make things better. That's the hope. That's the passion. Okay? People are not always right, and they're not always wrong. And that's a hard belief for me to let go of sometimes. Okay? In my standards of faith, I want to say, they're on the right side, they're on the wrong side. Then I have to remember what it means to be not only an educated person, but a mature Christian. We have to have a tolerance for ambiguity. I don't know about you, but sometimes maybe people use the word different. Okay? The word different, I think, can be a wonderfully useful word. How many times has someone asked you, well, how did you like that experience? And you think about it and say, oh, well, it was different. And so you hear that and you say, okay. Should I push them and try to really figure out what different means? Or should I just assume that they don't quite know themselves whether they're in favor or not in favor of what had happened, and so they're just using the word different, okay? Or how many times have you heard, what do you like about that pastor? Well, he or she they're different. And so we try to take that into play as well. And how many of you have ever asked the question, well, how was the sermon? Well, it was different. And so different can be a wonderful word that simply reminds us that maybe the Romans text that Paul shared with us, particularly when he wrote, if as much as possible as you can be or do, live at peace with others, okay? That, I think, is Paul's kind of human insight, that living at peace with some others that are different or not quite like us, is that as best you can, which is the parable story, as best you can, what God has given you to be able to do, live at peace with others. I think in the end, what this parable is telling us is best shared in this way. God has given us a garden, and the garden is your life. And God has asked you to tend that garden as best you can. But you're to remind yourself that you're just renting the garden for a while, okay? You be the best tender and gardener that you can be with the life that's been given to you. But in the end, when you have done your best, you are called by the grace of God to turn all of that over to God with expectations and hope that God continues to work for your best and the best of the world. Some time ago, I was at a church in Savannah, Georgia, and out front, they had what they considered to be their evangelism ethic, and it was this: God says, love everybody, I'll sort them out later. And in some respects, I think that's a true acknowledgement, is it not? The challenge as best we can to love everyone. And in the end, it will be God's decision about what happens to all of us. But that's a grace and a faith that we can live with. So, different United Methodist, enjoy spending the rest of your life gardening and tending it and making your life for yourself and others as good as that can be. But remember, through the grace of God, in the end, God will take care of it. Amen.